backed losing their faith and losing their religion, Nietzsche, picking up on this cultural shift, declared that God is dead.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Welcome, my name is Ryan, and if you've been with us over the past couple months, you've been with us on this 6-week journey where we're asking the question, why God? Who needs God in this 21st century life that we now have? Now, it's not a new question. It's a question that's been asked forever, and it's nothing new for society to ask this. However, today it seems even more prevalent because we live in a world that's just divided, a world that's distracted, a world that's disenchanted, a world dominated by science, technology, individualism, consumerism. And this gives an idea that we have an answer to everything in all of life's mysteries. Sociologists call this culture that we live in secular, which simply secular just means a culture with no religious or spiritual foundation. And then we find increasing numbers of people in our culture who do not believe in God. Pew Research in 2019 put out a report titled, "In the U.S., Decline of Christianity Continues at a Rapid Pace." And here's what they discovered. If you look back at the silent generation, that would have been like my father's parents, those born in the 1920s to the mid-1940s, 84% of them would have identified as a Christian. And the boomer generation, this would be my mother's generation, those born in the mid-40s up into the 60s, 76% of them would have identified as a Christian. And we're going to skip Gen X because they're busy. We were all busy outside running around and drinking from a hose, to be asked. We skip to the millennial generation, those born in the 80s up into the 90s, and just 46% of them identify as a Christian. And so, as we close out this series, let's take some time and address 3 groups of people. And so we're going to shift from one group in particular, and we'll talk about all 3 and maybe one at a time. And so hang tight, pay attention, and we'll have a little bit of fun with it. So here we go. 3 groups I want to talk to now. The nuns, near a nun, those of us who have a nun in our life, and Pharisees. Now, the nuns, not the N-U-Ns, the N-O-N-E-S's, if we want to talk about the other nuns, we call up our Catholic friends. And the Pharisees, they're called Pharisees because they're not fair, you see. Now, if you remember from the start of this series, we talked about the nuns, and as we've talked about already, there's this trend of people who are disconnected or leaving religion. And this trend has created this term that they use, nun. The most recent polling as of 2021 said that 23% of adults in America consider themselves a nun. Now, this does not mean that they are necessarily hostile towards any religion. It's just not attractive to them. They just don't have any interest. And now, if you sat down and you talked to one of these nuns, you might find them to be highly spiritual, but no interest in religion. Perhaps someone listening or watching this might actually consider yourself a nun. Maybe you've just not spoken it out loud for fear of repercussion. And now the second group of those would be someone who has a nun in their life. Perhaps a family member, a coworker, or a friend. And we all likely fall into that category. I mean, that there's someone in your life who would call themselves a nun. And then our third group for today, we'll just call them Pharisees. From a literal perspective, the Pharisees of Jesus' day were well educated about scriptures, and they were gatekeepers of doctrine and the accuracy of understanding. And the Pharisees, they were all about truth. And looking at Jesus' interaction with them, you'll find that they mastered in, and were focused on the rules, almost exclusively, even to the detriment of a relationship. A modern day Pharisee, they might live life primarily according to the rules and focus on being right with little or no regard for relationships. And now, if you haven't figured it out in the last few years, it's become extremely obvious that we are a divided people. And the topic, it doesn't matter. Just feels so much safer and comfortable for us to take a position and just hold on to it with clenched fists, rigor, and passion. I mean, take Kansas City barbecue. Jack Stack's the best. No, Q39's the best. No, Casey Joe's is the best. When we all know that it slaps. Slaps is the best barbecue. I mean, college sports, we always hear who the best one is, you know, and KU's the best at basketball, and KU is not the best at football. I mean, pets, cat people versus dog people. And that shouldn't even be an argument because cats aren't pets. They're like little dictators that kind of do whatever they, you know what I mean. Okay, so those are silly ones. Those are silly examples. But you know the biggies, right? Politics, race, environment. Most recently, to rear its head in the political realm again is the abortion issues. And then religion. These are the big ones that, you know, people very divided on, butt heads on. And if you find yourself as a nun or as a Pharisee, and here's what happens. You're going to take a tightly held position when it comes to God, Jesus, religion, based on the rules, or it's based on rejection. The truth is, most of us have questions and doubts about what we believe. But we don't ask them of others. We don't even ask them of ourselves. Instead, we just make bold statements about what we think we know. But let's look at another way. Let's look at the Jesus way. And for this, we'll call it kind of this middle road. You know, you've got these two extremes, and there's Jesus in here who's working on relationships. And it's challenging to go this relational way. It's challenging when you find yourself out on one of those edges to look at the relational way. And honestly, choosing Jesus can be unnerving, uncomfortable, but it's also life-giving. And the more chances I take to try to have conversations, the more I find myself in the middle of these two other extremes. And now, to get there to this place, you have to begin by asking questions. Don't be afraid to ask yourself questions, but ask questions of others, and then listen. Ask some more questions, and pray. Many times our fear with asking questions is we figure if we have questions or doubt and we ask them out loud, we may appear like we're losing faith in what we believe. We may fear that we're sliding from being a believer to being a nun. So we just react and we grab on to the truths and facts like a modern day Pharisee. And then we just launch word bombs across the bow of our ships towards others. But the question of why God is not a new question. Right at the beginning of our true source, the Bible, the question gets asked very boldly. And it takes place with Adam and Eve in the garden. And however you view that story, whether you view it as fact, allegory, or myth, which myth would be probably one of the greatest ones ever written. But however you view it, it explains so much to us. The story is the beginning, the official beginning of mankind. So when Adam and Eve decide to disobey God, to do something contrary to what God has asked them, and eat from the one tree that God asked them not to eat from, right then, in word and deed, they declare, God, we don't need you. Right then, the question gets asked, why God? Who needs him? And Adam answered, not us. Now, if we're honest, we have times in our lives when we ask and answer these questions, why God? Why today? And it could be intentionally or unintentionally. We'll either do it by words or by our behaviors. Now let's press the pause button right there. If by chance you consider yourself in the none category, or you're leaning that way, could I challenge you to reconsider your position? to move from whatever early life experiences you had and lean in for an adult-based faith journey. I want to challenge you to discard the undeniable as what you're experiencing now as unexplainable. And also, there's a great chance that there are more people in this family like you than you realize. If I can encourage you, I want to encourage you to take a step, maybe even today. I want you to know that in this faith community you can belong, even before you believe. Oh yeah, it's true. You can come to a weekly group. You can build relationships. You can even serve as you're wrestling with who you think Jesus is and can I trust this new Jesus. And lastly, before we hit the play button, let me challenge you to be honest. Be honest with yourself. Self-deception always leads us to bad decisions. And it always leads us into going bad directions. Thomas Nagel, an atheist author and professor of philosophy of law, wrote in one of his books a very honest confession. And he says, I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I am right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And so we take away from this that there's an important difference between I don't believe and I don't want to believe. Did you lose faith over something that happened? Or something you read? Or did you decide to stop believing because faith got inconvenient? And so then you go out collecting data that supports your unbelief. If you want God to exist, then lean in and seek answers. However, if your departure from faith revolved around your own will, that's not going to suffice. St. Augustine said this, we love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. When we won't admit what we suspect to be true for fear of what that might mean, there's something else next. What is it? Well, you're going to have to ask him to answer that question. And maybe you've wrestled with, if God exists, well, then I'm guilty. No, we've all made mistakes. We've all tried to cover up, hide, and forget those mistakes. However, if we lower our defenses and acknowledge that mistake might have bigger implications than just ourselves, well, all of a sudden, this little spark starts to become a flame of belief. In the midst of that mistake, it takes on a bigger role, and then it becomes sin. But now what am I supposed to do? What do I do with sin? Perhaps you've wrestled with, if God exists, I'm accountable. We've all wanted to play God. Adam and Eve wanted to play God. But this game creates an illusion of autonomy that it's all just about me. So unaccountable people make regrettable decisions. And now if you put two autonomous people in a relationship, here's what happens. If both people are so into themselves, you'll wind up with unresolved conflict. And so here's a problem with this. If you begin to admit God, well, then you have to submit to God. Because if there is a God out there, a God that will hold you accountable, suddenly you're accountable. Now I get it, none of us want to submit. But admission points to submission. Maybe if God exists, then I have to admit I'm wrong. No one wants to admit they're wrong. Remember Happy Days? The Fonz had made a mistake and he had to admit in the episode, that he was, and he couldn't do it. And it made for a funny skit, but it's not so funny in real life. Pride gets in our way. Don't let pride limit you or hold you back. Humility is always the way forward. Humility will make us bigger, wiser, and smarter. The simple words, I was wrong, is the most direct route to discovering what is right. And if God exists, then how do I wrestle through the face that I'm guilty, I'm accountable, and I'm wrong? You didn't want God to be, but He is. But by the way, that is such great news. See, when we acknowledge that the issue is our resistance, we find ourselves right smack in the middle of God's epic narrative pursuit of mankind. And here's why that's good news. If Jesus was right then, if God exists, there's forgiveness. If Jesus was correct, which there's a lot of evidence that says Jesus was correct, then if God exists, there is forgiveness. See, Jesus is a redeemer. He takes the guilt, shame, embarrassment, mistakes, and uses them to declare your worth. The exchange is those things, you, for His life. I mean, this is mind-blowing here. Your mistakes, your imperfections, that is God's platform to demonstrate His love for you. Paul wrote it this way, but God demonstrates His own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God touched down and showed His love by entering into this relationship with mankind. And every relationship demands sacrifice. You cannot have a relationship with someone and be mutually autonomous. The only way to have a healthy relationship is with sacrifice. And every offense requires forgiveness. Every offense requires us to come together for restitution. And with Jesus, this is the grand narrative. All the evidence points to this fact, that this is the stream you and I live in and the stream that we swim in. That through Jesus Christ, His life, death, burial, and resurrection, God demonstrated His forgiveness and restitution. That is good news. And if God exists, then there's a relationship. Because to resist accountability to God is to resist relationship to God. No matter what you've done, God longs for a relationship with you. And if you've ever raised kids, it's easy to understand that rebellion leads to broken relationships. However, a broken relationship with God can be restored. And God took the steps to create the path for this to happen. Because if God exists, then there's truth. Then there's a basis for moral law, a basis for justice. There's morality, a foundation for the laws of nature, the laws in your heart that you respond to every day. If God exists, then there's forgiveness, relationships, and truth. Who wants God? At some point in time, none of us do. But who needs God? I do. And in truth, we all do. Now, you may not know this, but Jesus had siblings. He had these half-brothers, half-sisters. The New Testament gives us some names of some of those siblings, and one of them was James. And before Jesus died and resurrected, his brothers and sisters, they actually thought he was crazy. They didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. For even his brothers did not believe in him. Now, after the resurrection, after they saw everything Jesus said was going to happen, they all changed their mind. Weird, huh? They said, oh man, Jesus, I was wrong. I watched you die. I laid flowers at your tomb. And now here I am looking at you, talking to you. And so Brother James, he admits he is wrong. He submits to Jesus, to his brother, as Lord. And he received forgiveness for his vocal, public, non-support of Jesus. And so years later, in 62 AD, we read from historians that the high priest Ananias, he does this illegal thing. He calls together the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish leadership, and they form a court, and they go to prosecute and try James for blasphemy. And they find him guilty, and then they stone him to death because he had faith in his brother Jesus. I mean, to summarize James' life, I believe I died for what I believe. Before he was killed, James writes this letter. And it was copied and it traveled all over the place. And and being that letters are highly important, it's very important that you're creative and you name it correctly, and so they called it James. And here's what James writes to the first century Christians. But you know what? He's writing it just as much to you and I today. Come near to God, and He will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Humble yourself before the Lord, and He will lift you up. Humble yourself before the Lord. This is how you draw near. It's the same for any healthy relationship, that you humble yourself. And then James, he says, regardless of how long you went away, how far you walked away, no matter what you did, humble yourself and God will lift you up. Why God? Who needs God? I do. You do. We all do. Now here's a challenge for you. No matter which group you find yourself in, some of us need to surrender, to recognize that you are indeed in need of grace, mercy, forgiveness, and that you are in need of God, but also in need of a Savior. To believe, just like James did when he comes to this awakening, that yes, Jesus, you are the Son of the living God. I need grace, mercy, forgiveness. For others, you're ready. You're ready today to obey, to take that next step in your faith journey, to go public, to be baptized, to publicly identify yourself with Jesus, to proclaim out loud, I need God. And if you want to get baptized, just let one of us know. Let's do this. We'll make the arrangements and get it done. We'll help you make this very important public declaration. And now for others, obedience is that you'll be challenged to walk the Jesus way. That middle road, if you will, to lean in, to ask questions, and to really listen to the none in your life. Listen and love. Ask questions rather than make statements. Now, a challenge for all of us, no matter what step of life we're in, wherever we are, all of us need to be challenged to be humble. Whether you find yourself as an intellectual nun or a justified modern-day Pharisee, perhaps we could recognize that we don't have all the answers. That I'm not always right. And to remind myself that the relationships around me are more important than me being right or in control. We need to ask ourselves the question, can I lay down my right to be right? Let's pray. God, thank you for your word that is always true. Thank you that you do exist, and that because you exist, we have forgiveness, we have relationships, and we have truth. And that, God, as we've learned through this series, that whatever it is that has hurt us in life, that those images of you weren't correct. And that if we'll look at Jesus and we'll look into your word, we can find the true depiction of you through the man Jesus Christ. Spur us to be in your word, to pray to you, to learn from you. We love you. It's in Jesus'